Conversation with John Canena is sponsored in part by Venus Travel Incorporated in Chicago, the agency that has served the Chicagoland area for over 55 years, which is still owned and operated since 1968 by the Canena family. Again, Venus Travel, the premier agency for over 55 years, is a proud sponsor of A Conversation with John Canena. And now, on to our episode. Good evening and welcome to another edition of A Conversation with John Canena. Tonight, we are honored to have on again for the second time here in our podcast, author William S.Bike. William wrote the book Streets of the Near West Side, winning political campaigns and celebrating a proud past. And also, Bill has edited the essays on Earl Renfro and A Man of First. Bill has been formerly, he directed the communications at Loyola University here in Chicago, the University of Chicago Graduate School of Business, the University of Illinois Chicago College of Dentistry. And of course, Bill has earned over more than 50 awards in journalism, publication, media, and of course, 3 Peter Lisgore Awards, the top honors in journalism. Bill, thank you for coming on. And before I start talking to you, our main topic here tonight is about the early 60s accidental deaths of 2 infielders that likely cost the Chicago Cubs and the Chicago Whitesox several pennants in the 60s and early 70s. Absolutely. I don't know how to thank you. First of all, how you doing, young man?
Doing very well. And Jen, that was one of the best introductions I ever got. So I appreciate that.
Oh, thank you. Well, you well-deserved. The entire
line of what I achieved.
Yeah, I'll tell you, well-deserved. And I'm honored to have you on. And I thank you for saying yes to me that second time here, because this is tremendous. But of course, you know that my favorite book, Bill, is the forgotten 1970 Chicago Cubs, which again, we're going to promote. I think I've read it 4 times now.
Oh,
and every time I read it, I love it. So,
terrific. I appreciate that.
Fantastic. Let's start with this. You wrote a beautiful, maybe I'll use the wrong word. It was a couple of weeks ago, caught my eye. You wrote a column or kind of an essay that caught my eye, and it started with Kenny Hubbs, the infielder of the Chicago Cubs in the 1960s. And I think he was the 1962 Rookie of the Year.
He was.
And after that, reading on, I learned a little bit about a gentleman called who was called Johnny Smolen, which we'll get into, a Chicago White Sox top prospect. Let's start with Hubbs, Bill, because I just really heard about Hubbs, read about him a little bit, but can you go back to those Hubbs years with the Chicago Cubs?
Yeah, well, Kenny Hubbs was the Rookie of the Year in the National League in 1962. He hit 260, which was respectable, but it was really his fielding that was just incredible. And so, that was the team. The Cubs already had William Sano and Banks. So they were starting to get better. And so, Hubbs came up in 62, like I said, he hit 260. Tailed off a little in 63, hit 235, but he wasn't there for his hitting. He was there for his fielding. He was the first rookie in baseball history to win a Gold Glove Award in his rookie season.
Wow.
He set several fielding records that year, and he easily won Rookie of the Year. And so the way he was playing for the Cubs was actually no surprise. As a 13-year-old, when he was playing Little League in the 1954 Little League World Series, there was a play in which he was playing shortstop, and he ran all the way in the right field to catch a fly ball. And he had played that whole series with a broken toe, and he was that fast that he could do that anyway. So this guy had incredible range, and those of us from Chicago are familiar with Chicago softball and the extra player, the short center, when we play softball. Well, Kenny Hubbs was like having a short center because he was like an extra infielder. He could just, move to his left, move to his right, go into the outfield. So when he was playing second base for the Cubs, it was like they had a short center. Now, that was an era where most middle infielders were short guys. You think of the guys like, Joe Morgan a little bit later in the 60s. Sure. he was 6'2", and so you usually don't see tall guys, playing shortstop and second base like that. So because he was so tall, again, that really helped him with his range. He could catch pop flies that most infielders couldn't get. So the guy in the field was just incredible. And I compare his attitude to the game towards Michael Jordan. You could never get Michael Jordan out of the lineup. Even his rookie year when he hurt his leg and they figured he was done for the season, he made it back for the playoffs because Michael Jordan just wanted to play all the time.
Right.
And that was Ken Hubbs too. So, besides playing in the Little League World Series with a broken toe, he was a football player in high school too. He actually played a game in a cast. He found a size 14 shoe someplace and he put it over the cast and he played in the football game. So you could not get this guy out of the lineup, no matter what team he was playing. So, like I said, he played football. So he's a multi-sport star. So Notre Dame actually wanted him to come play quarterback. They were hoping to sign him. John Wooden wanted him to play basketball. I mean, this guy could pretty much do anything. And thank goodness for us Chicago fans, he chose the Chicago Cubs. And so they sent him to the minors. It was called Class D back then. And his first year was 1959, and he was nominated for Class D Player of the Year. So even as a minor leaguer, he was doing pretty well. Now, you remember who the Cubs shortstop was at the time, a fellow named Ernie Banks. So
Yeah.
good as Hubbs was, Hubbs, the shortstop, was not going to dislodge Ernie from shortstop, but actually,
can I just stop you there for 1 second?
sure.
Was there ever that thought that they would move Banks maybe earlier to first base and put Hubbs at short, or no during that time frame?
Ernie had come off his 2 MVP seasons at that point, so they weren't thinking of it yet. Plus, Ernie's knees weren't bad. Part of the reason they moved Ernie to first base was because he had knee problems. But the Cubs had a really good keystone combination. Ernie was at short, but Don Zimmer was at second base in those days, and Don Zimmer was an all-star second baseman. So it kind of looked like they didn't have a spot for Hubbs, but they knew this guy was, going to be a potential great. And so they actually got rid of Don Zimmer. And so in September of 61, only 2 years after he started in the minors, the Cubs brought up on the same day Ken Hubbs and Lou Brock. So
Wow.
they brought up two fantastic rookies, and these guys, kind of, they were friends, they were rookies at the same time. They played in the minors together. There's a picture of the two of them together you can find on the internet. I mean, these guys were the dynamic duo of rookies, and it was only a question, who was going to be the rookie of the year. So 62, the Cubs put Hubbs in the lineup at second base. You had Lou Brock in the outfield. And so that year, Hubbs got the rookie of the year. I mean, Brock did okay. He wasn't the player, the Hall of Famer he later turned out to be. But Hubbs in his rookie season led the National League in rookies in games, hits, doubles, triples, runs, batting average too. And even though his hitting cooled off a little bit in 63, if you remember, Lou Boudreau was one of the Cubs broadcasters then.
Yes.
Boudreau, having managed in the major leagues besides played in the majors, was a good judge of talent. And Lou was absolutely sure that it was just a sophomore jinx that year, that Hubbs' bat would come around. There was one day he went 5 for 5 against Pittsburgh. So, I mean, this guy's hitting probably was going to come around too. But also, besides the records I mentioned earlier, he set a major league record with 78 consecutive games and 418 total chances without an error.
Wow.
And so his glove from 62 is actually in the Baseball Hall of Fame.
Incredible.
So, yeah.
Bill, I want to stop you for a sec, because
Sure.
you brought up Brock and you brought up Kenny. Was Brock the left fielder and Billy Williams the right when he did come up, or was it vice versa?
Brock, I believe, was the right fielder, and
Okay.
And Billy was in left. But Brock for most of his career with the Cardinals played center field, and that's where the Cubs would have needed him later in the 60s. So Brock was a speedster. He really could play anywhere. They happened to have him in right, but he easily could have played center. Could have spelled Billy in left field. Not that Billy was going to sit down, but Billy later in his career played a little bit of first base for the Cubs. So Brock could have spelled him there. So they, one of the things that later in the 60s that the Cubs were criticized for, particularly Leo DeRocher, was that
Yes.
They played the same guys day in and day out in the same positions. With Brock and Hubs, they could have, they could have platooned a little bit, which would have been good. We saw, in '69 and '70 in particular, how tired these guys were just at
Oh
the end of
yeah.
the season because Leo played the same guys day after day after day. So anyway, so I mentioned Joe Morgan earlier, and so think about
Yes.
the Cincinnati Reds of the early '70s. They were good. They had Pete Rose, they had Johnny Bench. They won the pennant in '70, didn't win the World Series. It wasn't until they got Joe Morgan, who you don't think of immediately when you think of the Big Red Machine, that they became the Big Red Machine because Joe
Right.
Morgan was the spark plug. He was the guy who got on base so Bench and Rose could drive him in. So that's what Kenny Hubs was for the Cubs. He was kind of the spark plug. So got a couple of quotes. Ernie Banks said he was the zenith in inspiration and enthusiasm, as well as desire and determination. So Ernie was pretty good coming up with that one. And one of the Cub pitchers, Lindy McDaniel, said he just had a real positive effect on the ball club. Now, you and I know, Jen, that later in the '60s, Ron Santo became the captain of the
Definitely.
team. But really, Sano looked to Hubs for leadership. And so, even though Hubs was only in his early 20s, he kind of was a team leader. And for example, Hubs asked Ron Santo to stop smoking, so Santo did. Because Hubs asked him to. He was just that
Wow.
well respected. So, here you go. In 1963, you've got William Sano, Banks, Brock, and Hubs in the lineup every day. At least four of those guys were going to make the Hall of Fame. One of the starting pitchers, Dick Ellsworth, won 22 games. The closer, Lindy McDaniel, saved 22 and won 13 in relief. So that was a good team, and that was the first Cub team to finish over 500 since 1946. So, people think that they were, kind of bad for 20 years, but actually they had that one stellar season in '63, and they really looked like they were going to contend in 1964.
Well, and you know what's great about this, the way you're breaking this down. Now, can you imagine like in 65, 66, like we're going to get to this point, if he would have lived, of course, you had the Huntley coming in, you had Bill Hance, you had Fergie coming in. Now this thing
Yeah.
starts to it's like gold bullion, like
Oh
from
my
the
God.
Beverly Hillbillies.
Yeah.
The gold was coming into Wrigley Field, right?
They're a great team anyway. Add Brock and Hubs, and it's just the possibilities are unbelievable. Few people remember too, this was not a Cub town back then. This was a White Sox town because every year in the '50s, the Sox contended. They finished second or third either every year, and the Cubs, they were finishing, pretty far down in the standings. And so, this was definitely a Sox town. Now, Hubs was a real public relations professional's dream. Like I said, he was 6'2", the suntan crew cut All American male. He was religious. He didn't smoke, didn't drink, yet he loved to have fun anyway. He did a lot of charity work. The original Mayor Daley said there isn't a man in Chicago who wouldn't have been proud to have him as a son. So, I mean, this was a popular
Wow.
guy. And so you think of how Mike Ditka was in advertising in the '80s, Michael Jordan in the '90s, where you couldn't put your TV on without seeing, Mike Ditka or Michael Jordan. So Hubs probably would have been on TV, banking, shaving, putting gas in his car, and generally
Yeah, exactly.
making the Cubs the number one team in town. So he had it all, and unfortunately, he also had a fear of flying as well.
Oh, we did. Okay.
So, most guys, when they've got a fear of flying, they may, like go see a psychologist or something like that. But,
Sure.
Hubs was, the type of guy who took everything on. And so he actually took flying lessons. And so he learned how to fly his own plane. And so in February of '64, Ron Santo visited Hubs in California because they were good friends. And Hubs gave Santo a ride in his plane, and everything looked good. And on February 13th in '64, after playing a charity basketball game at Brigham Young University, Hubs took off from Provo, Utah, back to his hometown in California. and unfortunately, he never made it. It was below
Right.
zero, snowy weather, and the plane crashed. And Hubbs and one other passenger had passed away, in the plane crash.
He was piloting that Cessna plane, right, by himself, right,
He was
Bill? Yeah.
he was piloting the plane. Yeah.
Yeah.
About 1,300 people went to his funeral. Um, Almost every Cub traveled to California. Sano Banks and a couple other guys were the pallbearers. The city actually shut down its city offices. He had died about a month before spring training in '64, and his teammates never recovered. So Sano was so, like I said, he and Sano were friends. Sano was so upset that he actually consulted a priest because
Wow.
he just couldn't understand why somebody who was such a good person, had died at such a young age. So now you had the '64 Cubs. They were expected to contend. They stumbled into the season. By the end of May, they were 16-22, and unfortunately, management panicked. So they already didn't have Hubs. And 2 weeks later, the Cubs made what was considered the worst trade in baseball history, sending Lou Brock to St. Louis. And the Cubs were done. They were done for '64, '65, and '66. So a team that should have been contending in '64 ended up near the bottom of the standings again and did even worse in '65 and '66.
Right. And to think, they trade Brock in 64, correct, Bill?
Right.
In 64, the Cardinals go to the World Series against the Yankees, and I think they defeat the New York Yankees.
They
And
did.
there's where the Lou Brock prominence
Yeah.
starts to come out. And boy, you hit it right on the head. Not to get away from this for just 2 seconds, I don't know what's a worse trade, Lou Brock for Ernie Brillo or Phil Esposito for Pitt Martin on West Madison. So it's always debated here in this Italian household. But go ahead.
At least the Blackhawks without Phil Esposito, they went to the Stanley Cup Finals a couple of times, but
That's
without
true.
Brock, the Cubs never even got to the playoffs, let alone the World Series. So I still got to call that a worst trade.
The worst one, right? I have to tell you, Brulio comes here with a sore arm, correct? Or
Yeah,
he wound
yeah,
up having a sore arm, and who knows, it was probably a torn rotator cuff. But the way you depicted this about, how everyone was just like in shock. I don't know how to say this and be correct in this interview, is this way. Now we hear something because maybe of all the social media streams that we hear a passing of someone or a death of a star. But this back then, like you said, was like, wow, our all-star second baseman has
yeah, for sure.
passed away.
Yeah.
I can imagine the shockwaves had to be from here all the way to Milwaukee.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And like I said, most of the Cubs went to the funeral. I mean, they really love this guy. And so, like I said, '64 looked to be a good year for the Cubs. They had finished over 563. They had a great lineup. So think about this. Lou Brock leads off. He gets on base. He's going to steal. So now he's on second. Hubbs is either going to get a hit or get an infield out. Brock is on third. Now you got William Sano and Banks coming up. You're guaranteed to get in a run. So every time that lineup comes up, the other team is going to be worried because there's no way to keep them from scoring. Think
Sure,
about that.
sure,
You
right,
know,
right.
Kessinger and Beckert later in the '60s, hey, they were great, but they didn't get on as often as Lou Brock did, and they didn't steal like Lou Brock did. So
Exactly.
the Cubs would have been pretty much unstoppable. They would have been like Ozzie Smith leading the Cardinals in the 1980s. You couldn't stop Ozzie Smith on the base paths,
No,
and you couldn't
no.
have stopped Lou Brock either.
Not either. Bill, that's a great analogy you just put, because the next time we see something like this of trying to get a run an inning was when we had Bobby Denier and Ryan Sandberg.
Yeah,
Denier would boom, get the second, Sandberg base hit to right, bunt him over. Perfect analogy by you, because that's the next time we really see this combination of hope. Too bad it wasn't a Brock and Hubbs. It had to be Denier and
yeah.
Sandberg, right?
And with Denier and Sandberg, it worked. They made the playoffs in '84. You couldn't stop those guys.
Wow,
So
incredible.
also 1964, you made the good point. Cardinals won the pennant, but they wouldn't have had Lou Brock on the team if he was still with the Cubs. That was also a race where the Cardinals won it by winning only 93 games, which was pretty low for that era. So could the Cubs have won 93 that year with Brock and Hubbs and with the Cardinals not even a contender? Yeah, I think so. So Cubs actually could have won their first pennant in 64 and not even, had to wait till 69.
And correct me if I'm wrong, the Philadelphia Phillies had a 6-game lead with 12 games left and
Yeah,
blew
you're
it. And blew
absolutely
it.
right about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it would have
Yeah.
looked like the Phillies, but maybe the Cubs would have been nipping at their heels. And then when the Phillies collapsed, the Cubs might have been right there. So
Right.
they
Right.
might have won their first one in 64. Now, Sports Illustrated in 1993 speculated that with Hubs and Brock, that the Cubs would have won the pennant in 69 and pretty much every year in the early 70s from 72 to 75. So it's not just me saying this, it's Sports Illustrated.
Sports Illustrated.
Yeah. And so, John, you mentioned my book earlier, and I point out in the book that in 70, the Cubs only finished 5 games out. So Sports Illustrated didn't think they were going to win then, but, with Brock and Hubs been worth 5 games, I think so.
Sure. Sure.
So you look back at the 69 season, and a lot of experts look at the July 8th game in New York where Don Young dropped the 2 fly balls as the turning point of the season. The loss was bad enough. The loss was to the Mets. That was worse. But the worst thing was is that Ron Santo, really criticized Young in the media after that. And so Young was kind of shell shocked after that. He was never the player in the second half that he was in the first half. And I think that Hubs was so respected among the Cubs. If he would have told Santo, "Hey, look, lay off the kid," but I don't even think Don Young would have been out there because Lou Brock would have been out
Yeah.
there. And so Sports Illustrated even speculated that the 2 balls that Don Young dropped, that Hubs would have caught one of them because it was kind of
Short
shallow.
center.
Yeah, and that Brock would have caught the other one, because Brock's fielding was very good. So,
Right. Right.
the Cubs don't even lose that game then. So they probably, win the pennant pretty easily that year. But, without Hubs and without Brock, then we saw what happened. The Cubs came close every year, but they didn't quite make it.
You know what? And Bill, great point again, because like you said, probably Young would have never came up from the minors. We would have
Right.
never probably saw Jimmy Qualls up from the minors. And,
Yeah.
and then again, who knows what would have happened if like Oscar Gamble would have stuck with that team.
Oh,
The
yeah. I mean,
craziness of that. Yeah.
think about how deep their bench would have been.
Oh my God.
You had
Yeah.
Williams, Brock, and Hickman in the outfield, and guys like Oscar Gamble on the bench. I mean, they'd have been incredible. It's like those Yankee teams in the 70s where they kept acquiring like the Jay Johnstones and stuff like that because
they were so deep. Yeah, they were so deep. Bill, I got to ask you because you saw him play, meaning Hubs. Could you compare him to Sandberg?
I was a little kid when Hubs played, so I've seen it on TV. But Sandberg, I think Sandberg was stronger at the plate, but Hubs I think was stronger in the field. And so, I think if Hubs still would have been around by the time, the Cubs got Sandberg, they'd have found a spot for both of those guys.
And I got a feeling Glenn Becker would have been our Paul Popovich behind us,
exactly.
behind Hubs, right? Our utility infielder.
And sure. we all like Kessinger and Beckert, but they weren't Ken Hubs. And
no,
I think guys like Santo who knew all of those guys would have probably said the same thing, even though Santo and Beckert were good buddies and actually roommates.
For sure, for sure. I'm gonna just take a little pause here. We're visiting with William S.Bike, author of a few books here. We're talking tonight. The theme is about Ken Hubs, who tragically passed away in 1964. And we're going to talk now on our second half of this podcast night about a top White Sox picks, Johnny Smolen. Bill, of course, wrote the book, The Forgotten 1970 Chicago Cubs Go and Glow, a favorite of mine. And this book is still available for purchase on Amazon. Just a great read about a 1970 team. And if you read it, it'll tell you that it was a season that should have been probably remembered more than that 69 season. I really want to touch on this next individual. And I love and if you have anything else to say about Hubs before we go on about Kenny Hubs.
Perfect transition. So
yeah,
Hubs is over here. Picture Johnny Smolen.
Johnny Smolen, and I think you're going to really lead away with this one. Of course, a top pick for the Chicago White Sox, an all-around athlete, Johnny Smolen. Of course, here again, tragedy hits, but Take us through Johnny Smolen, Bill.
All right. Well, he was a multi-sport star in grade school and high school. He's a Chicago guy. He grew up on the north side, so he played at St. Sylvester's grade school. And then DePaul University at the time had a high school called DePaul Academy. They now have DePaul College Prep, which used to be Gordon Tech. But back then they had their own high school. So Smolen played at DePaul Academy. So he quickly made the varsity basketball and baseball teams. He was a top swimmer. He's another guy like Ken Hubbs, solid citizen, very popular with his teammates and classmates, vice president of his high school class, National Honor Society member. So he was a middle infielder like Hubbs, played second and short, and he was the quintessential five-tool guy. He could hit with power, run, field, throw. As a high schooler, he put up batting averages in the 400s and the 500s. And so back then, if you remember, there was no free agent draft,
Right.
so teams could sign whoever they wanted. So the White Sox had their eye on this guy, and they were planning on signing him as soon as he graduated from high school, which would have been 1963. So on the afternoon of August 22nd, 1962, before he started his senior year of high school, he and seven of his buddies went swimming in Lake Michigan at Oak Street Beach. And by 3 o'clock, when his buddies couldn't find him, they alerted the lifeguards. Lifeguards looked for him for a couple hours, and they found that he had drowned. And nobody knows how, because this guy was an expert swimmer, so his buddies didn't see it happen, and they just found him. So DePaul Academy, I mean, everybody there was brokenhearted. They held a basketball doubleheader in his honor and dedicated their 1963 yearbook to him as well. So again, we lost a young guy that could have made a difference. So if Smolen had lived, he'd have started his minor league career with the White Sox in 63 after he graduated from high school. So if he was on the same schedule as Hubbs, he probably would have joined the team in 66. Now, 67, the Sox finished only 3 games behind the Boston Red Sox, who won the pennant. And they did it with Ron Hansen at short hitting 233,
right,
and Wayne Causey at second hitting 226. So would a five-tool guy like Smolen have been able to take the place of one of those guys? I don't have any doubt about it. And would they have been able to win 3 or 4 more games and win the pennant? Yeah, I would think so.
Sure.
So that also sets up a possible 1967 All-Chicago World Series. Think about it.
Yeah.
Cubs that year finished third, and the Cardinals finished first, but Lou Brock wouldn't have been in the Cardinal lineup. He would have been in the
He
Cub
would have been in
lineup.
the Chicago Cub lineup. Yeah.
Yeah. So, the Cubs possibly could have won in 67. If the Sox would have won in 67, would have had our first All-Chicago World Series since 1906. Wouldn't that have been incredible?
Right.
Now, another thing, if the Sox had won the pennant in 67, they never would have traded Tommy Agee to the Mets in 68. And that makes it even more likely that the Mets wouldn't have been able to beat out the Cubs in 69, because Tommy Agee was their spark plug.
Sure.
But getting back to the White Sox, so in 72, the Sox finished only 5.5 games behind the Oakland A's, who ended up winning the World Series. Smolen would have been 27. He would have been in his prime. And so would a five-tool guy in his prime been worth 6 more victories? I think so. I think the Sox could have won in 72. And so, if the Cubs were, contending in 72, which they certainly would have been with Hubbs and Brock, could have had another All-Chicago World Series in 1972 as well. So we've never seen an era ever where the Cubs and the Sox were frequent pennant winners. And so had they had these two guys in the late 1960s and early 70s, that would have been that era. It would have been like the 50s in New York, where the Giants and the Dodgers and the Yankees were winning every year.
Going at it, yeah.
Cubs and Sox just about every year. Wouldn't that have been fantastic? So, I've said stuff like this, and people are like, well, you don't really know that would have happened. But I think you can pretty well bet that if Lou Brock and Ken Hubbs were in the Cub lineup, they'd have done better than they did, and they did pretty good without them. And I think if the Sox would have had one more hitter, I mean, you remember 67, they just had no hit at all.
They couldn't hit.
Yeah, they had Joe Horland, they had Gary Peters. Earlier in the decade, they had Juan Pizarro. But
And I got to tell you, Bill, to stop you there about the 67 team, I interviewed the nephew of the great Rocky Colavito.
Oh
And,
yeah, Rocky, yeah.
and Colavito came here in 67 at the end of July with Ken Boyer because
Yeah,
the Sox, like you're saying, were so close. But in
yeah.
Colavito's book, the Cleveland Iconic Slugger, he writes that what at Comiskey Park, and maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong, the White Sox brass, the field crew, if it was Bossard's crew, whoever the crew was then, would put the baseballs in a freezer to deaden them
They
so the
did,
other
yeah.
teams wouldn't hit homers, let
Yeah.
alone the White Sox were hitting homers. And Calavito says he hit a ball in Comiskey that should have been on the Dan Ryan that probably just went to the third baseman. So
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right about that. I mean, that's been said that they actually used to put the balls in the freezer, and some pitchers said that the balls would actually be ice cold when they got them in their hands. So yeah,
it had to
but
be like throwing cement, exactly.
yeah,
But you know what I love? How you're breaking this down about Smolen and Hubs. But again, you did this in the 1970 book too, like how you said the Cubs handled the Cincinnati Reds and how
yeah,
you depicted that whole Baltimore series if they
yeah,
would have went against Baltimore in the World Series, right?
yeah. In my book about the '70 Cubs, I wasn't just speculating. I went to a computer site called What If Sports, and I actually ran it through their computer, and it shows that the Cubs would have won the World Series over Baltimore in 1970.
Bill, I got to ask you, going back to Johnny Smolen, the White Sox top pick, how did you find this? Because like you threw it at me, I was like, Johnny Smolen. But then when I read about his athleticism, how were you able to you got some great information. How were you able to get that?
Well, actually, full disclosure, he was my cousin, and
Okay.
so as a little kid, I saw him play, and when he passed away, I was only a little guy, but everybody in the family talked about what a great ball player he was and how the White Sox were going to sign him. And then about 20 years ago, my aunt Evelyn, his mother, passed away, and so when my folks and I were going through her stuff, I found the newspaper clippings that said he hit like 585 one season and
Wow.
400 another season, and found the Paul yearbooks that she had and stuff like that. So I donated all that stuff to Paul University. They were very happy to get things from the Paul Academy because they don't have a lot of that stuff. But my aunt also had a videotape, which originally had been an 8 millimeter film of her son playing ball. And I'll tell you, it's kind of grainy, it's kind of dark, but he looked like he had the tools. So this is not just family pride. I mean, this guy was a good ball player.
For sure. No, great, great perspective on. So I think on that 72 team, we would have saw Melton the third and Johnny was a shortstop, correct?
Yeah, he played shortstop and second base. So,
Yeah.
he would
So
have
we would
played.
have seen him at short, and yeah, that would have been something. And of course, that was the year when the White Sox had the great Dick Allen.
Oh, yeah,
So can you
fantastic.
imagine this culmination coming together? And who knows, those red pinstripes going up against those Cub blue pinstripes in 1972.
Yeah, fantastic. Like we talked about Hubs, you got Brock, you got Hubs, batting first and second, and then you got the big hitters coming up. Well, same thing with the White Sox. You got Johnny Smolen batting first or second, and then you got Melton and Allen coming up. I mean, that was a big scoring team anyway. They would have scored even more.
You gave me a little bit of goosebumps in this podcast, and I got to tell you, when you said in the 1950s, of course, my dad told me this, that the Chicago White Sox was Chicago's team. I'll never
Yes.
forget a line by Al Lopez. It was in 1960, I think. I think that's the year when the New York Yankees lost to the Pittsburgh Pirates on Bill Mazeroski's home run
Yes, exactly.
in Game 7.
Yeah.
That year, the White Sox were one game behind with 11 games left in 1960 after they had won in 59. And Al Lopez said, we played unbelievable in the last 11 games. We went 10-1. The Yankees went 11-0.
Oh man.
So, I mean, can you imagine, here you go 10-1 then your season, and, they just couldn't get over that hump, right? But
Another year where the Sox finished one game out was 1964. The Yanks finished first. The Sox finished second, one game out. If the Sox, I don't know how they could have squeezed one more game out, but if they could have, it might have been the Cubs versus the Sox in the World Series in '64 too,
boy,
because wouldn't that have been something?
that would have been something too. And I know that was the year I think of the lefty on the White Sox, Gary Peters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So again, just some great. I mean, I don't. How do you to go back? And of course, I can't wait to get this out so people from that our era will watch this. But to remember all these like little nuances that it reminds me of the Lou Rawls song "If I Wish I Should I Could Have," kind of thing. But tremendous, tremendous. Anything else about Johnny Smolen that you'd like to say here?
Just it's like it would have been fantastic if both teams were Chicago's darlings. Like we said, in the '50s and early '60s, it was the White Sox. It was the White Sox. By the late '60s and '70s, it was mostly Cubs, except for that '72 season. So it just would have been fantastic with each of those guys on each side of town to have, a dominant American League and National League team just like New York did in the '50s. It would have been fantastic.
I got to ask you, do you think, let's say in our lifetime now, I know we're going into the last quarter here, in our lifetime, do you think we're going to see like that era, like they saw in New York with the Giants, the Brooklyn Dodgers, and of course, at that time, the New York Yankees? You think we'll ever see it where, the Cubs are going? I think Brooklyn played the Yankees, what, almost 4 years, 5 years straight in the 1950s. You
It's
think we'll
pretty
see it
close, yeah.
here? You think we'll have an era of that? Because we've really never had it.
No, and I was hopeful, when the Ricketts, bought the Cubs, and they said, we really want the Cubs to be like the Red Sox or the Yankees, contending every year. And think about that great era from starting in 2015. I mean, the Cubs were in the playoffs every year. It was fantastic. They won this World Series one time. I wish it would have been, more. But we actually did see a kind of a mini era like that. They didn't make the World Series every year, but they made the playoffs every year for a few years, and so it can be done. And we see how Houston makes the playoffs every year, and we see how the Dodgers make the playoffs every year. So it's definitely possible. So I'm hoping hope springs eternal.
I mean, because the all sports, but I just really start to notice it more and more with baseball. But then again, in all sports, do you think the economics, the business of the sports has kind of hurt that era of 70, we say 70 years ago in the 1950s, where, like I'll remember, I just looked at them from 1968 to 1973. I had the same baseball cards of Kessinger, Beckert, Banks, Sano, Williams, and a few fill-ins. Now I don't know who could collect baseball cards, and oh, he was on the team last year. No, he got traded. No, he came back. Oh, yeah. I mean, do you ever believe that there will ever be that era again of where players will stay with one team?
That we won't see again. In my book, I mentioned how you look at the Cubs of that era, some guys played together 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. And a lot of those guys, Glenn Beckert in particular, say they were like a family, because
Yeah,
they were together so long. And you won't see that again, because even if a guy is with a good team, he's gonna go where the free agent money takes him. So if a guy's on the Dodgers and he wants to make more money, he may go to a worse team. He's also got the possibility of being the guy to turn that bad team around too. So because of the way things are structured now, you'll never see that again, because guys just don't stay together that long, either because of free agency. Also, teams start to sell guys off too. If they're not going to make the playoffs this year, we talk about teams being buyers or sellers. What are they going to do? Are they going to start selling guys off? You
sure.
didn't, you didn't hear that back then. Nobody was saying like, oh, gee, the Braves aren't going to win the pennant this year. Guess we'll trade Hank Aaron. I mean, nobody would ever thought of that.
Yeah.
And just like the Cubs never would have thought of trading Ernie Banks too. It wasn't going to happen. Ernie played his entire 18-year career with the Cubs and then started coaching with them too. And I don't think we're going to see that again.
I have to ask you before I let you go here tonight, because I've loved all your work and, of course, the things you've done in journalism publication. I have to ask you, is there another? Because when I saw this about Hubs and Johnny Smolen, Kenny, I loved it, and I go, boom! I reach out to you right away. Do you have anything on the horizon in regards to Chicago sports? Will you be writing something? Do we have any surprises down the Mr. Bike's line?
I don't have another book in the works right now, but I do some writing for Medium.com, and I occasionally write a story about the Cubs or the White Sox, but it's always historical. It's not about the modern era. So I think I'm focusing a little bit more on shorter essays. And you talked about me sending you the information about Hubs and Smolen, and I'll put that up on Medium one of these days, so
Yeah, it was
people will be able to
fantastic.
see it. So not
It-
planning on writing a book, but every time I write a book, somebody always asks me, when's your next book? And I say, I'm never going to write one again. And then I do. So I'll never say never again.
I have to tell you, I mean, of course, like I told you, holding up this book again tonight, The Forgotten 1970 Chicago Cubs Go and Glow by William S.Bike. A fantastic read. We've had Bill on here before. The front cover, even the back, has that 1970 picture that you could have bought for $1 at Wrigley Field, and I
I
have it
think I
in my
did
basement.
too. I think that was my picture actually that I had from when
I love that. I love that you treasured that picture like you treasured those Topps baseball cards. Bill, just again, fantastic work. Love this last article. Love the fact that I was able to get a hold of you. We did this so quickly within 2 weeks. I mean, your work is tremendous, and I'm always kindly just seeing what you're doing, following you. So again, anytime you would like to come back on here, we're going to get this out to the public here in about a week or so. But anytime you want to come on here and talk sports or whatever you're doing, sir, you are, Bill, always welcome. I truly thank you for tonight.
Well, I appreciate that, and I love being on your podcast. It's a great give and take between the two of us, and we'll definitely have to do this again.
You got it, and the best to you, and have a great remaining of the summer. And like I says, we'll get this out to the public. And I always live it like this. William, Bill Bike, keep doing what you're doing. You are truly an inspiration to all of us, and I truly thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
All right. Good night, and take care.
Okay.